She was 17 years old. She stood beneath a bare tree in the frozen Bosnian winter, a noose already around her neck, her wrists bound behind her back. German soldiers surrounded her. An officer stepped forward one last time and offered her a choice. Name your comrades, reveal the locations of your commanders, and you will live. She looked him in the eye and refused. A moment later, the rope went taut. Lepa Radic, teenage partisan fighter, member of the Yugoslav resistance, daughter of a working-class family from a small Bosnian village, was dead. She was 17 years old. It was February 8th, 1943, and her story, for all its brevity, would echo through history for generations. Jos, in this video, we are going to tell the full story of Lepa Radic, the teenage girl hanged by the Nazis in occupied Yugoslavia. But to understand what she did and why her death became a symbol that outlasted the war itself, we need to go back to the beginning, to the world she was born into, the war that consumed it, and the extraordinary resistance movement she gave her life to join. We will also meet the other remarkable young men and women who fought alongside her, the brutal commanders who hunted them, the atrocities that defined the occupation, and the reckoning, however incomplete, that followed Germany's defeat. This is a story about courage under impossible conditions, about what ordinary people are capable of when their world is on fire. So without further ado, let us begin. Yugoslavia in the 1920s and 1930s was a young and complicated country. Created in the aftermath of the First World War, it was a patchwork kingdom of Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosnians, Macedonians, and Montenegrins, peoples who shared geography but often little else in terms of language, religion, tradition, and political ambition. The Kingdom of Yugoslavia, as it was known from 1929, was held together by a monarchy that ruled with increasing authoritarianism under King Alexander I, who was himself assassinated in 1934 and then under the regency of Prince Paul and later the young King Peter II. Beneath the surface of this fragile unity, ethnic tensions simmered. Communist and nationalist movements competed for influence, and ordinary people struggled through the global economic depression of the 1930s with very little. Into this world, on December 19, 1925, in the small village of Gasnica, near the town of Bosanska Gradiška in what is today northwestern Bosnia and Herzegovina, a girl was born. Her parents named her Lepojka, meaning beautiful one in Serbian, though she would be known to everyone simply as Lepa. Her surname was Radić. Her father, Dusan Radic, was a known communist activist, a man who believed in a different kind of Yugoslavia than the one the monarchy offered. It was from him that Lepa would absorb her politics, her courage, and her conviction that the world as it existed could and should be changed. Lepa grew up in a modest household. Her family was not wealthy, and the village life of the region, the Bosanska Krajina, was one of hard agricultural labour, close community, and not a great deal of opportunity for a girl born to a dissident father in a conservative rural region. But Lepa was, by all accounts, extraordinary. She was bright, intensely curious, and possessed of a charisma and self-possession that set her apart from her peers. She read voraciously when she had access to books. She absorbed her father's political ideas with the enthusiasm of a true believer, not someone who simply inherited ideology, but someone who actively chose it, reasoned through it, and made it her own. By her early teenage years, she had become a member of SKOJ, the Savez Komunističke Omladine Yugoslavia, the League of Communist Youth of Yugoslavia, the youth wing of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. This was not a casual affiliation. SKOJ membership meant participation in underground networks, clandestine meetings, the distribution of political materials, and constant risk of arrest in a country where the authorities took communist organizing very seriously. Lepa was not yet 15 years old when she committed herself to this path. What happened next to Lepa and to Yugoslavia as a whole cannot be understood without grasping the catastrophic speed with which the country's fate changed in April 1941. By then, war had been consuming Europe for nearly 2 years. Poland had fallen, France had collapsed, Britain stood alone, and the Nazi war machine appeared unstoppable. Yugoslavia had managed to stay out of the conflict through a combination of diplomacy, geography, and desperate neutrality. On March 25, 1941, Prime Minister Dragiša Kvetković, under enormous pressure from Berlin, signed Yugoslavia into the Tripartite Pact, aligning the country with Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. The reaction inside Yugoslavia was immediate and volcanic. Within 2 days, a group of Serbian military officers staged a coup, removing the pro-German regents, placing the young King Peter II on the throne, and tearing up the pact. Enormous crowds took to the streets of Belgrade shouting "Bolje grob nego rob," better the grave than slavery. Adolf Hitler was furious. He ordered the immediate destruction of Yugoslavia. Operation 25, the German invasion of Yugoslavia, began on April 6, 1941, in the early hours of the morning. Without a formal declaration of war, German aircraft appeared over Belgrade and began bombing the city. The Luftwaffe flew over 300 sorties in the first 2 days alone, targeting residential neighborhoods, government buildings, hospitals, and the National Library of Serbia, which was destroyed along with hundreds of thousands of irreplaceable manuscripts and books. Simultaneously, German, Italian, Hungarian, and Bulgarian forces poured across Yugoslavia's borders from every direction. The Royal Yugoslav Army, poorly equipped, organizationally fractured by ethnic tensions between its Serbian, Croatian, and Slovenian components, and caught completely off guard by the speed and scale of the assault, was overwhelmed in days. On April 17, 1941, just 11 days after the invasion began, Yugoslavia's military commanders signed an unconditional surrender. The country had ceased to exist as an independent state. What replaced it was a nightmare. The Nazis and their allies carved Yugoslavia into pieces. Germany annexed large parts of Slovenia, absorbing them directly into the Reich. Hungary took back regions it had lost after World War I. Bulgaria occupied Macedonia. Italy seized Dalmatia, Montenegro, and large swaths of the Adriatic coast. And in the heart of the former kingdom, the Germans created a new entity that would become one of the most horrific regimes of the entire Second World War, the Nezavisna Država Hrvatska, the independent state of Croatia, known by its Croatian acronym NDH. This puppet state, ostensibly independent but entirely dependent on German and Italian military support, was handed to the Ustasha movement, a Croatian fascist organization led by Ante Pavelić. The Ustasha had been founded in the 1930s as a terrorist organization and had spent the years before the war in exile in Italy and Hungary, dreaming of a racially pure Greater Croatia. Now, with German patronage, they had their state, and they set about building it with a ferocity that even some German officers found disturbing. The NDH encompassed Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and parts of Slavonia, and its population included large numbers of Serbs, Jews, and Roma, who the Ustasha immediately identified as racial and ideological enemies. What followed was one of the most concentrated campaigns of ethnic mass murder in European history. Within months of the NDH's founding, the Ustasha had begun systematic massacres of Serb civilians. Villages were burned, entire communities were executed, sometimes with a speed and brutality that shocked even hardened German military commanders who had seen the Eastern Front. Ustasha units used knives, axes, and hammers as well as firearms, in many cases, to save ammunition. Women and children were not spared. Priests were killed. Churches were set alight with their congregations inside. Thousands of Serbs were thrown into ravines or drowned in rivers. Estimates of the total number of people killed in the NDH during the war, principally Serbs, Jews, and Roma, but also political opponents and dissident Croats, range from several 100,000 to over 1 million, with the most commonly cited scholarly figures suggesting somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 deaths. The most notorious site of mass murder was the Jasenovac concentration camp complex, established in 1941 on the banks of the Sava River, which would become the largest concentration camp in the Balkans. We will return to Jasenovac in detail because its shadow falls across the entire story of the Yugoslav resistance, including Lepa Radic's own story. The invasion and occupation did not break Yugoslav resistance, it ignited it. The Communist Party of Yugoslavia, which had been organizing underground for years under the leadership of a man who called himself Tito, moved quickly to channel the shock and rage of the population into armed resistance. Josip Broz Tito, as he was actually named, was a Croatian-Slovenian communist of remarkable organizational genius and personal charisma who had risen to lead the CPY in 1937. He had survived Stalin's purges, which had eliminated most of the CPY's previous leadership. He had maintained the party's clandestine networks through the years of royal repression. And when Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, lifting the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact's strange freeze on communist resistance to fascism, Tito moved immediately to launch an uprising. On July 4, 1941, the CPY's leadership issued a call to armed resistance. The Yugoslav partisans, as they became known, were born. In the early months, resistance was scattered, spontaneous, and desperately dangerous. Small groups of fighters armed with whatever weapons they could steal, scavenge, or capture attacked German and Ustasha positions, sabotaged railways, and tried to establish liberated zones in the mountains and forests away from the occupied towns. The reprisals were immediate and catastrophic. German policy in Yugoslavia was explicit. For every German soldier killed, 100 Yugoslav civilians would be shot. For every German soldier wounded, 50 would be executed. These were not empty threats. In the autumn of 1941, following partisan attacks in the Šabac and Kragujevac areas of Serbia, German forces, under the command of General Franz Böhmer, conducted mass reprisals that resulted in the shooting of thousands of civilians. In Kragujevac in October 1941, approximately 2,800 men and boys, including school teachers and their students who had been dragged from classrooms, were executed in a single day. The massacre at Kragujevac became one of the defining atrocities of the occupation, a wound in Yugoslav national memory that has never fully healed. Despite, or perhaps because of, the scale of German brutality, resistance grew rather than collapsed. People who might have remained passive were radicalized by the massacres. Young men and women who had nothing to do with communist politics joined the partisans simply because collaboration meant complicity in horrors they could not stomach. The partisan movement was not purely communist in its composition, though the CPY provided its organizational backbone and ideological direction. It included people of all ethnicities, all classes, all religions, drawn together by the shared experience of occupation and the shared desire to fight back. By the end of 1941, the partisans had managed to liberate significant territories, briefly creating a free republic centered on the town of Užice in western Serbia. The Užice Republic lasted barely 2 months before a massive German counteroffensive, combined with the betrayal and violence of the Chetniks, the rival royalist resistance movement under Draža Mihailović, forced the partisans to abandon Serbia entirely and retreat into the mountains of Bosnia, Montenegro, and Herzegovina. But they survived. Tito survived. And the movement, though battered, was alive. It was into this world, this burning, blood-soaked, extraordinary world, that Lepa Radic entered as a partisan fighter. She was 15 years old when the invasion happened, 16 when the uprising began. In the Bosanska Krajina region where her family lived, the violence of the NDH fell with particular force. The area had a large Serb population, and Ustasha units conducted some of their worst massacres in the villages of the Krajina in 1941. Lepa's own community was touched by this violence. The injustice of it, the sheer obscene randomness of the slaughter, reinforced everything her father had, taught her about why the existing order had to be opposed and overturned. In 1941, at the age of 15, Lepa took the step from political activism to armed resistance. She became a member of the partisan movement. What did it mean, practically, to be a teenage partisan fighter in wartime Bosnia? It meant living in almost constant physical danger. It meant moving through forests and mountains, sleeping in the open or in farmhouses whose owners risked their own lives by offering shelter. It meant carrying messages between units, smuggling weapons and medical supplies, nursing wounded fighters, conducting reconnaissance, and occasionally participating directly in combat operations. For young women in the partisan movement, there was the additional dimension of operating in a social environment that was being remade on the fly, one in which the communist ideology of gender equality clashed constantly with the traditional patriarchal attitudes of the rural communities from which most fighters came. The partisans were, at least officially, committed to the equality of women. Tito's movement made a point of incorporating women as fighters rather than merely as support personnel, a stance that was genuinely radical in the context of 1940s Yugoslavia. Thousands of women and girls joined the partisans, and hundreds of them died as fighters. Lepa Radic was one of them. By 1942, Lepa had become an active and trusted member of her partisan unit, which operated in the Bosanska Krajina region. She was known for her courage, her intelligence, and her ability to maintain calm under pressure, qualities that would prove absolutely essential in the circumstances that were coming. She also continued her political work, operating as an organizer for SKOJ, the Communist Youth Organization, recruiting new members, conducting political education sessions, and helping to maintain the morale and ideological cohesion of the resistance networks she was part of. She was 16 then. 17, doing work that would have tested a seasoned adult operative. And she did it in a region that was under constant German and Ustasha pressure, where the line between life and death was always thin and always close. The winter of 1942 to 1943 brought one of the most dangerous periods of the entire war for the Yugoslav partisans. The German High Command, growing increasingly alarmed by the partisans' resilience and their ability to maintain liberated zones across large parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina, launched a series of massive coordinated anti-partisan offensives that would later be known to the partisans as the enemy offensives, numbered 1st through 7th. The fourth of these, known to the Germans as Fall Weiss, Chaos White, or Operation Weiss, began in January 1943 and was the largest anti-partisan operation to that point. The Germans committed over 90,000 troops, including German, Italian, Croatian and Chetnik forces, to a massive encirclement operation aimed at destroying Tito's main force and eliminating the partisan leadership once and for all. The partisans, numbering around 20,000 fighters plus thousands of wounded and civilian refugees, were caught in a brutal winter campaign in the mountains of western Bosnia, fighting their way through snow, ice and encircling enemy forces toward the Neretva River. It was during this period, in February 1943, that Lepa Radic was captured. The exact circumstances of her capture are not fully documented in all historical sources, but what is clear is that she was taken prisoner by German forces in early February 1943 in the context of the massive sweeping operations that Fall Weiss had set in motion across the Bosanska Krajina region. She was 17 years old. She was a known partisan fighter and SKOJ activist. And her captors knew that she had information they wanted, specifically the identities of other resistance members and the locations of partisan units operating in the area. What happened in the hours and days between her capture and her execution on February 8, 1943, speaks to a character of almost incomprehensible fortitude for someone so young. Lepa was interrogated. German forces conducting anti-partisan operations in Yugoslavia were not gentle in their questioning techniques. Torture was routine. The threat of execution, of the execution of family members, was a standard tool. The Germans who held Lepa Radic made her an explicit offer. Tell us what you know, give us names, give us locations, and you will live. It was not an idle promise. Informers existed. People broke under pressure. The Germans had every reason to believe that a teenage girl might be persuaded to trade information for her life. They were wrong. Lepa refused to reveal a single name. Accounts differ slightly in their specifics, but the core of what happened is consistent across multiple sources. When pressed to identify her comrades and commanders, Lepa reportedly told her, interrogators, in words that have become among the most famous utterances of the Yugoslav resistance, that her comrades would reveal themselves when they finished the job that the Germans had started. She did not betray anyone. On February 8, 1943, Lepa Radic was taken to a location near the village of Vranjes in the Bosanska Gradiška municipality. A noose was prepared. German soldiers stood in formation. One final time she was offered the chance to save her life by naming names. She refused. According to multiple accounts, as the noose was placed around her neck, Lepa shouted her last words. Long live the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, long live the partisans, long live Tito. She was hanged. She was 17 years, 1 month and 20 days old. It was one of the coldest, darkest periods of the entire occupation, with German forces rampaging across Bosnia in their largest anti-partisan sweep yet, and in that darkness, a teenage girl from a village most people had never heard of demonstrated a quality of courage that would be remembered long after the names of her executioners had been forgotten. The story of Lepa Radic did not die with her. It travelled through the partisan networks, passed from unit to unit, from fighter to fighter, gathering the force of legend even before the war was over. In a movement that desperately needed symbols of resistance, of defiance against overwhelming power, her story was perfect in its terrible simplicity. A child had been asked to betray her friends and her cause to save her own life, and she had chosen death. Whatever one thinks of the political ideology she served, the human act at the centre of that story, the refusal to purchase survival at the cost of others' lives, is one that resonates across all ideological divides and has not diminished with time. The partisans who heard her story fought harder. The communities who learned of her death grieved and were galvanized. And after the war, when Tito's Yugoslavia was building its national mythology of resistance and liberation, Lepa Radic was elevated to the status of national hero. In 1951, she was posthumously awarded the Order of the People's Hero of Yugoslavia, the highest honor the socialist state could bestow. Schools, streets, and public buildings were named after her. Her image appeared on monuments and in textbooks. The teenage girl from Gasnica became a symbol of her nation's soul. But Lepa Radic's story does not exist in isolation. It is part of a larger tapestry of extraordinary and terrible events, a tapestry woven from the lives of hundreds of other partisan fighters, from the brutality of occupying forces, from the crimes of collaborationist regimes, and from the complex, difficult process by which Yugoslavia was eventually liberated and its tormentors held to account. To understand the full weight of what Lepa did and why it mattered, we need to know more about the world around her, about the other remarkable individuals who chose resistance, about the commanders who chose repression, and about what happened to all of them in the end. So let us keep going, because there is much more to tell. The Yugoslav partisan movement that Lepa Radic belonged to was one of the most remarkable resistance organizations produced anywhere in occupied Europe during the Second World War. By the war's end, it had grown from a few thousand poorly armed fighters to a genuine army of over 800,000 soldiers, liberating Yugoslavia largely through its own efforts with Soviet support only in the final stages. But in 1941, 1942 and the early months of 1943, when Lepa was alive and fighting, the partisans were vastly outnumbered, outgunned, and under constant pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Understanding what they were up against requires understanding not just the Germans, but the full web of forces that occupied and terrorized Yugoslavia. Germany's direct military presence in Yugoslavia was primarily organized through two occupation commands. In the ND Height, the puppet Croatian state, German forces operated alongside the Croatian military and the Ustasha militia. In occupied Serbia, a German military administration under General Harold Turner held power, with Turner personally responsible for implementing the reprisal policies that led to mass civilian executions. The Germans also maintained Army Group E in the Balkans, tasked with occupation duties and anti-partisan operations, a command that would gain particular notoriety and whose ultimate fate we will examine in detail. But the Germans were not alone in their brutality. The Italians, who occupied large parts of the Adriatic coast, Montenegro and Dalmatia, conducted their own anti-partisan campaigns with considerable ferocity, though Italian forces were generally, though not universally, less systemically murderous towards civilians than their German counterparts. And the Ustasha, the Croatian fascist regime, were in many ways the most savage of all. The Ustasha movement under Ante Pavelić was, ideologically, a hybrid of Croatian nationalism, Catholicism twisted beyond recognition, and racial ideology borrowed and intensified from the German and Italian models. Pavelić himself, a lawyer-turned-terrorist, had spent years organizing violence in the service of an independent Croatia and had masterminded the 1934 assassination of King Alexander of Yugoslavia. When the Germans handed him power in April 1941, he immediately set about constructing a racial state. His regime declared that the NDH would be a state for Croats, and that the Serb, Jewish, and Roma populations that made up large minorities of the NDH's territory had three options: conversion to Catholicism for the Serbs, expulsion, or death. In practice, the regime moved quickly toward the third option, and did so with the enthusiasm and a personal brutality that shocked even their German patrons. German officers who witnessed Ustasha massacres in 1941 sent reports back to Berlin describing what they had seen with a mixture of alarm and disgust. Not because they objected to violence against the populations the Nazis themselves considered subhuman, but because the random, frenzied nature of the Ustasha killings was creating a security problem, driving survivors into the arms of the partisans and destabilizing the occupation. The Jasenovac concentration camp system, established in August 1941 on the banks of the Sava River in Croatia, was the centerpiece of the Ustasha's industrialized murder. Unlike the German death camps in occupied Poland, which were primarily designed for the rapid mass killing of Jews transported from across Europe, Jasenovac was a death camp of a more chaotic, drawn-out variety. Its victims, principally Serbs, Jews and Roma from within the NDH, were worked to death, starved, tortured and killed in a variety of methods that included mass shootings, knifing, drowning in the Sava and burning alive. The camp system's chief administrator, Vjekoslav Luberic, known as Max, was described by contemporaries as a psychopath who took personal pleasure in violence. Estimates of the total number of people killed at Jasenovac range widely, from around 77,000 in the most conservative scholarly assessments to 700,000 in some Yugoslav communist-era claims. Most contemporary historians accept a figure somewhere between 77,000 and 100,000. Whatever the precise number, Jasenovac stands as one of the worst sites of mass murder in the entire Second World War. It was in the context of this environment of industrial murder, ethnic massacre, and total occupation, that the partisan resistance operated and in which young people like Lepa Radic made their choices. The question of why someone as young as 15 or 16 would choose the extraordinarily dangerous path of armed resistance becomes easier to understand when you consider the alternative, which was to live under regimes that saw you as a subhuman, to be exploited, expelled, or exterminated. For many young Yugoslavs, especially Serbs, Jews, Roma, and progressive Croats and Slovenes who rejected the NDH's fascism, the partisans were not just a political choice, they were a survival mechanism. They were the only force that was actively fighting to create a Yugoslavia in which all its peoples, regardless of ethnicity or religion, might have a future. Among the young men and women who made this choice, several stand out not just for the extraordinary circumstances of their lives and deaths, but for what their stories reveal about the character of the resistance and the nature of the occupation. One of the most remarkable of these figures is Stjepan Filipović, a Bosnian Croat communist and partisan fighter whose death on May 22, 1942, produced what may be the single most iconic image of resistance in the entire Second World War. Filipović was born on January 27, 1916, in Opuzan, in the Dalmatian hinterland, into a working-class family. He trained as a locksmith and became involved in communist youth politics in the 1930s, a natural progression for a young man of his background and intelligence who saw the inequality around him and wanted to change it. When the invasion came in April 1941, Filipović joined the partisans immediately and became a commander of a partisan detachment operating in the Machva region of Serbia. He was an effective and aggressive fighter who participated in numerous operations against German and collaborationist forces. In the autumn of 1941, during a German sweep against partisans in the Machva region, Stjepan Filipović was captured by the Nedić forces, the collaborationist Serbian government army that operated under German command, and handed over to German authorities. He was taken to Valjevo in Serbia, where he was subjected to a military trial and sentenced to death. The execution was scheduled for May 22, 1942. German authorities brought a crowd of Valjevos citizens to witness it, intending the public hanging to serve as a deterrent and a demonstration of German power over the resistance. What happened instead was one of the great acts of defiance in the history of the war. As Stjepan Filipović stood on the scaffold with the noose around his neck, rather than displaying the fear his executioners expected, he raised both arms above his head, hands balled into fists, and shouted at the crowd in Serbian, "Death to fascism! Freedom to the people!" That moment was captured in a photograph by a German officer named who took the image presumably as documentation of a routine execution. The photograph instead became one of the most reproduced images of the Second World War, an image of a man in the moment of his death choosing defiance over submission, raising his fists against the sky while soldiers with rifles stood below him. The photograph was later reproduced on a monument erected in Valjevo after the war, and a larger-than-life statue based On it still stands there today. Filipović was posthumously recognized as a national hero of Yugoslavia in 1949. Filipovic's story illuminates something important about the character of partisan resistance and the way in which acts of individual defiance in the face of death became the moral currency of the movement. The Germans and their allies could kill individual fighters, but they could not control the meaning that those deaths would carry. Each time a partisan refused to betray their comrades, each time someone shouted a last defiant phrase rather than begging for their life, the movement gained something that no amount of military force could take away: a story. Stories like Filipovic's, like Lepa Radic's, like the dozens of others that circulated through the partisan networks and eventually through the whole of Yugoslav society, were the sinews of the resistance. They told people that it was possible to maintain human dignity in the face of the worst that power could do. They demonstrated that there was a way to die that served the living, and they made the brutal arithmetic of German reprisal policy, the calculation that mass executions of civilians would break the will to resist, run up against something it could not simply overwhelm. Another figure whose story belongs alongside Lepa Radic's is Nada Dimic, born on June 5, 1923 in the town of Imotski in Dalmatia and executed by Italian fascist forces on June 4, 1942, the day before her 19th birthday. Nada was, like Lepa, a member of SKOJ and had been deeply involved in communist youth organizing in Split before the invasion. When Italy occupied Dalmatia after April 1941, Nada continued her underground work in the occupied city, distributing illegal newspapers, organizing resistance cells, and participating in networks that supported partisan fighters in the hinterland. She was arrested by Italian security forces in early 1942 and subjected to prolonged interrogation that, by all accounts, involved significant physical abuse. Like Lepa, she refused to provide information about her network or her comrades. She was tried by an Italian military court and sentenced to death. She was 19 years old, or rather, she was 18 because she was executed the day before her 19th birthday on June 4, 1942, near Split. Her execution, like Lepa's, was carried out by hanging. She was posthumously named a People's Hero of Yugoslavia in 1951. The pattern that emerges from these individual stories, the young SKOJ members, the teenage fighters, the teenage girls in particular who faced execution with extraordinary composure, is not a coincidence. SKOJ specifically recruited and trained young people to maintain their ideological commitments under pressure. The political education that organizations like SKOJ provided was not merely about Marxist theory or the history of the labor movement. It was also, fundamentally, about preparing people for the possibility of capture and death, about building a mental and emotional framework in which sacrifice was understood not as a waste, but as a contribution. The partisans were explicit about this. They knew that their members would be captured. They knew that some would be tortured. They trained their people to resist interrogation as a matter of military necessity because a broken partisan who gave up names could unravel entire networks and get dozens of other people killed. But they also trained them in something beyond mere operational security. They trained them to understand their own deaths, if it came to that, as meaningful rather than arbitrary. That framework, that conviction that dying without betraying was a form of victory, is what you see operating in the last moments of Lepa Radic, of Nada Dimic, of Stjepan Filipović, and of many others like them. The extraordinary courage demonstrated by young partisans like Lepa Radic and Nada Dimic must also be understood in the context of what surrender and capture actually meant in occupied Yugoslavia. This was not a war governed by the Geneva Convention, at least not on the German and Ustasha side. Partisan fighters who fell into German hands were not treated as prisoners of war. They were classified as criminals, terrorists, bandits, the loaded terminology that occupying powers throughout history have used to deny legal status and human rights to those who resist them. Under Wehrmacht orders in Yugoslavia, captured partisans were to be interrogated for intelligence and then executed. There was no prisoner of war status, no camp, no possibility of survival. The only real variable was whether a captured partisan would first be persuaded to provide useful information. The offer extended to Lepa Radic. The offer of life in exchange for names was genuine in one narrow sense. If she had talked, she might have been used as an informer rather than immediately killed. But informers in occupied Yugoslavia had extraordinarily short life expectancies regardless of what the Germans promised them, because the partisan networks were sophisticated enough to identify and deal with betrayers. Lepa almost certainly understood this. Her choice was not simply courage against self-interest, it was also an accurate assessment of the actual options available to her. The Germans who occupied Yugoslavia and conducted operations against the partisans were a varied group, ranging from career soldiers who would have served any government with equal professionalism to committed ideological Nazis who combined military violence with genuine racial and political fanaticism. Understanding who they were and what happened to them after the war is part of the full story of the occupation and of the justice, or the lack of it, that followed. The most senior German commander with overall responsibility for the Balkans theatre throughout much of the occupation was General Alexander Löhr, the commander of Army Group E from 1943 and from 1944, the Supreme Commander Southeast. Löhr was an Austrian-born career officer who had served in the Austro-Hungarian army in the First World War and had risen steadily through the interwar Austrian military before the Anschluss of 1938 brought him into the German Wehrmacht. As a Luftwaffe general, he had commanded the air fleet that conducted the bombing of Belgrade on April 6, 1941, the assault that killed an estimated 2,300 civilians in the city in a single day. That bombing, which was carried out without any declaration of war against a civilian population, was itself a war crime, though Löhr was never specifically charged for it. Löhr's real significance in the context of Yugoslav suffering came from his command of Army Group E and his role in anti-partisan operations and reprisal policies across Greece, Yugoslavia, and the wider Balkans theatre from 1942 onward. Under Löhr's command, German forces carried out mass executions of hostages and civilian reprisals against Yugoslav communities that harboured or were suspected of sympathising with partisans. The 100-to-1 reprisal ratio, 100 civilian executions for each German soldier killed, was explicitly ordered and implemented under his overall command. Villages were burned, population centres were emptied and their inhabitants executed. The scale of civilian death resulting from these policies across the entire Balkans region under German control ran into hundreds of thousands of people. Löhr was, in the fullest sense of the term, a war criminal. What happened to Alexander Löhr after the war is one of the more satisfying chapters in the incomplete story of Balkan justice. Unlike many senior German commanders who were tried by Western Allied courts, released after serving partial sentences, and allowed to live out their lives in relative comfort in the Federal Republic of Germany, Löhr had the misfortune, from his perspective, of surrendering to Yugoslav forces rather than to the Americans or British. He had been trapped in Yugoslavia as German forces retreated in 1944 and 1945, and when Germany surrendered in May 1945, he was in the custody of Yugoslav partisan forces, which were by then the triumphant liberators of their country and the governing power of the new Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. The Yugoslavs had no interest in the kind of lenient treatment that was already being extended to German officers by Western Allied courts. They had experienced the German occupation from the inside. They knew what Löhr had ordered. And they put him on trial. Alexander Löhr was tried before a Yugoslav military court in Belgrade in early 1947. The charges against him were extensive: ordering and facilitating the bombing of Belgrade without declaration of war, issuing orders for the execution of hostages and civilian reprisals, commanding forces that conducted mass atrocities against the civilian population of Yugoslavia. The trial was not by Western standards a model of due process. The Yugoslav communist government that conducted it had its own political interests in establishing the guilt of occupiers and the justice of liberation. But the crimes Löhr was charged with were real, documented, and undeniable. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. On February 26, 1947, Alexander Löhr was shot by a Yugoslav firing squad in Belgrade. He was 60 years old. Unlike so many of his colleagues, he did not survive long enough to write memoirs, to benefit from Cold War geopolitical deals, or to die quietly in a comfortable German retirement. But Löhr was not the only senior German commander with responsibility for crimes in Yugoslavia. Let us look at the man who commanded German forces in Serbia in the critical early period of the occupation, when the reprisal policies were first being implemented. General Franz Böhmer was the plenipotentiary commanding general in Serbia from September to December 1941, and it was he who personally issued the order for the 1,000-to-1 reprisal ratio, actually escalating it beyond even the Wehrmacht's standard policy, in direct response to partisan attacks in Serbia that autumn. Böhmer was an Austrian who brought to his role in Serbia a personal animus rooted in the memory of the First World War, when Serbian forces had fought against his Austro-Hungarian homeland. He described this explicitly in his orders to his troops, calling on them to remember the blood of German soldiers killed by treacherous Serbs in the First World War, and demanding that they act with brutal hardness. Under his direct orders, the massacres at Zasavica, Jajinci, Kragujevac and Kraljevo were carried out, claiming thousands of civilian lives. Böhmer, however, would never face justice for these orders. He was taken into American custody at the end of the war, and in 1947, while awaiting trial, he committed suicide in his cell at Nuremberg. His victims received no justice from him. The anti-partisan operations of 1942 and 1943 involved not just the regular German army, but also specialized units and SS formations that brought their particular brand of ideological violence to the Balkan theatre. The 7th SS Volunteer Mountain Division. Prince Eugen was one of the most notorious of these formations. Raised in 1942 primarily from ethnic Germans, Volksdeutsche, living in the Balkans, principally in Yugoslavia itself, the Prince Eugen Division combined military effectiveness with a savage disregard for the laws of war. Its members had personal knowledge of the terrain and the population. They often spoke Serbo-Croatian, and they had in many cases a personal stake in the conflict. The Volksdeutsche of Yugoslavia had complex relationships with their Slavic neighbours, relationships that the Nazi occupation had poisoned with racial ideology and competing violence. The Prince Eugen Division participated in all of the major anti-partisan offensives from its formation until the end of the war, and its record of atrocities against civilian populations in Yugoslavia was extensive. Villages suspected of harbouring or sympathising with partisans were burned. Prisoners were executed routinely. Torture was common. The division's operations in Bosnia, Montenegro and Serbia left a trail of burned villages and mass graves that was still being documented decades after the war. The Prince Eugen Division was commanded for much of its operational life by SS Obergruppenführer Arthur Phleps and later by other officers. But the man who presided over its most notorious period of anti-partisan operations was SS Gruppenführer August Schmidhuber, who took command in 1944. Schmidhuber was an Austrian SS general who brought to his command the full apparatus of SS brutality. Under his leadership, the Prince Eugen Division conducted operations in 1944 that resulted in the systematic destruction of entire communities in Serbia and the execution of thousands of civilians. Schmidhuber was captured by Yugoslav forces at the end of the war and tried before a Yugoslav military tribunal. He was executed in Belgrade in January 1947, just weeks before Löhr's own execution. The pattern is clear. Those German officers and SS commanders who fell into Yugoslav hands faced a significantly higher probability of execution than those who surrendered to Western Allied forces. Whether this represents superior justice or victor's justice is a question that historians continue to debate, but it is difficult to argue, looking at the specific crimes involved, that the men Yugoslavia executed were not genuinely guilty of the charges against them. One of the most complex figures in the story of the German occupation of Yugoslavia was General Hermann Furch, who served as Chief of Staff for various German commands in the Balkans and was later tried at the Nuremberg High Command trial. Furch was a professional soldier of the old school, meticulous, bureaucratic, deeply committed to military professionalism and correspondingly uncomfortable with the ideological violence that characterized the SS and the Ustascha. Yet he served the system that produced that violence, staffed the commands that issued the reprisal orders, and his bureaucratic professionalism made the machinery of occupation function more smoothly. At the High Command trial in Nuremberg, Furch was charged with war crimes related to the execution of hostages and the waging of aggressive war. His defense was the standard one. He had been a staff officer following orders, not a commander with independent authority to countermand those orders. The American tribunal at Nuremberg acquitted him on all counts in October 1948. He went home. He lived until 1961, dying at the age of 64 in West Germany. where he had quietly rebuilt a normal life. His victims did not have that luxury. The anti-partisan offensives of 1942 and 1943, the period during which Lepa Radic lived and died, were characterized by a specific German military logic that was as brutal in its systematic nature as the more frenzied Ustasha massacres. The Wehrmacht's approach to anti-partisan warfare in Yugoslavia followed patterns developed in part from operations in the Soviet Union and in part from the specific conditions of the Balkan theatre. The key principle was that partisan resistance could only be suppressed by destroying its social base, the civilian population that provided fighters, food, shelter, intelligence, and moral support. This was not a secret. It was explicit Wehrmacht doctrine. The orders for operations like Fall Weiss, the fourth enemy offensive that resulted in Lepa's capture and death, specified not just military objectives but population control measures, the evacuation or elimination of populations from areas of partisan activity, the seizure of food stores and livestock, the destruction of villages that could provide shelter, and the execution of anyone found in restricted areas, regardless of whether they were actually partisan fighters. Fall Weiss, which began in January 1943 and ran through March, was the most ambitious German anti-partisan operation to that point. It involved forces from Germany, Italy, Croatia, and the Chetnik movement, totaling over 90,000 troops, converging on the partisan main body in western Bosnia. The partisans, under Tito's direct command, were fighting their way toward the Neretva River with about 20,000 fighters and an enormous column of wounded soldiers and civilian refugees. The Fourth Offensive, as the partisans called it, was one of the most desperate periods of the entire war. The partisans were encircled, outnumbered, fighting in appalling winter conditions, carrying their wounded on stretchers across mountain passes, while enemy forces pressed in from every direction. And yet, through a combination of tactical brilliance on Tito's part, the extraordinary fighting qualities of partisan units hardened by years of guerrilla warfare, and the remarkable morale and endurance of the fighters themselves, the partisans broke through. They crossed the Neretva. They survived. The Fourth Offensive failed to achieve its primary objective of destroying the partisan main body, though it inflicted enormous losses and casualties. It was in this context, during the sweeping operations of Fall Weiss in the Bosanska Krajina region, that Lepa Radic was captured and killed. The German operation that caught her was part of the same massive military machine that was simultaneously trying to encircle and destroy the partisan main force to the south. In the Bosanska Krajina, German and Croatian forces were systematically moving through the region, clearing it of partisan fighters and sympathizers, burning villages, executing suspects. Lepa was caught in this sweep. Her capture was, in a sense, simply the mathematics of an overwhelming force applied against a small guerrilla resistance. Eventually, in those circumstances, individuals get found. But what she did with the circumstances of her capture was entirely her own. Now, let us turn our attention to some of the other remarkable partisan fighters whose stories are woven into the same tapestry as Lepa Radic's. Among the most celebrated figures of the Yugoslav resistance was Sava Kovačević, a Montenegrin partisan commander of remarkable personal bravery and tactical skill, who became one of the most famous fighters of the entire war. Kovačević was born on December 21, 1905, in the village of Petrovići near Nikšić in Montenegro, into a traditional Montenegrin family with a long martial heritage. He trained as a blacksmith but became involved in communist organizing in the 1930s. And had already spent time in prison for his political activities before the war began. When Italy occupied Montenegro in 1941 following Yugoslavia's defeat, Kovačević was one of the first to take up arms. He joined the partisans immediately and proved himself an extraordinarily effective military commander, combining personal physical courage that bordered on recklessness with a genuine gift for inspiring other fighters. Sava Kovačević rose to command the 3rd Shock Division of the Yugoslav partisans, one of the most elite formations in the partisan army. He participated in several of the most critical battles of the resistance, including the desperate fighting around the Neretva River during the Fourth Offensive in early 1943, where his division played a key role in breaking through the encirclement. But it was during the Fifth Enemy Offensive, Operation Schwarz, or Fall Schwarz as the Germans called it, which followed almost immediately after the Fourth, that Sava Kovačević met his end. The Fifth Offensive, launched in May 1943, was another massive German-led operation aimed at the partisan main body. This time in the area of the Sutjeska River in eastern Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Germans committed even more force than in the Fourth Offensive, including mountain warfare specialists, and the conditions were equally desperate. For weeks, the partisan main body, again encircled and fighting in mountainous terrain, struggled to break through the encircling German forces. On June 13, 1943, near the Sutjeska, Sava Kovačević was killed in combat. He was leading his division in a desperate breakout attempt and was hit by German fire. He was 37 years old. His death was a significant blow to the partisan leadership, which had come to rely heavily on his fighting qualities and the extraordinary morale of the 3rd Shock Division. But the partisans broke through regardless, emerging from the Sutjeska in July 1943, battered but intact, their leadership alive, their fighting capacity unbroken. The Battle of the Sutjeska, as it became known, was celebrated in Yugoslav communist historiography as one of the defining moments of the Liberation War, the moment when the partisans demonstrated definitively that nothing the Germans could throw at them would break them. Sava Kovačević was posthumously named a national hero of Yugoslavia and became one of the most celebrated figures of the resistance. His name was given to countless streets, schools, and public places in the Yugoslavia that emerged from the war. While fighters like Kovačević were conducting the military operations that kept the partisan army alive, the political and organizational backbone of the resistance was maintained by a network of underground operatives who worked in the occupied cities and towns, often under greater risk than the frontline fighters because they lacked the protection of being part of an armed group. One of the most important of these urban operatives was Rade Končar, a Croatian metalworker and communist organizer born on December 24, 1911, in Trebunje near Drniš in Dalmatia. Končar had been a trade union activist and communist organizer throughout the 1930s, serving time in Royal Yugoslav prisons for his political activities. When the invasion came in 1941, he became one of the most effective organizers of resistance in occupied Croatia, building networks, coordinating between the urban underground and the partisan units in the field, and generally serving as a crucial link in the chain that kept the resistance functioning. Rade Končar was arrested by Italian authorities in 1942 while operating in the occupation zone. He was subjected to prolonged interrogation and torture by Italian security forces who understood his importance to the resistance networks. Like Lepa Radic, like Nada Dimic, like all the others we have discussed, he refused to provide information about his comrades or his networks. He was tried by an Italian military court and sentenced to death. He was executed by firing squad on May 22, 1942, the same day as Stjepan Filipović, whom we discussed earlier in what appears to have been a coincidence rather than a coordinated execution. Rade Končar was 30 years old at his death. He was posthumously named a People's Hero of Yugoslavia in 1944, while the war was still ongoing. His name became perhaps more famous in post-war Yugoslavia than most, partly because the large Croatian electro-industrial company founded in 1946 was named Končar in his honor, a company that still exists today and employs thousands of people, making his name one of the very few resistance fighters' names that survived the dissolution of Yugoslavia in 1991 and remains in everyday use in the region. The question of what the young women of the partisan movement experienced deserves particular attention, because their story is distinctive in ways that go beyond mere gender. Yugoslavia's partisan movement was, in theory and to a significant degree in practice, one of the first modern armed resistance movements to fully incorporate women as combat soldiers rather than merely as support personnel. This was partly ideological. The Communist Party of Yugoslavia had a genuine commitment to women's equality as part of its political program, and integrating women into the fighting force was consistent with that commitment. It was also partly practical. In a guerrilla war where every able-bodied person was needed, and where the social base of the resistance included women as much as men, excluding them from combat would have been wasteful and counterproductive. The result was that tens of thousands of women served as partisan fighters, and several hundred were recognized as particularly distinguished and were posthumously named National Heroes of Yugoslavia. The experience of women in the partisan movement was, however, complex and contradictory. the formal commitment to equality coexisted with pervasive traditional attitudes among partisan fighters from rural backgrounds, who were often suspicious of or uncomfortable with women in combat roles. Sexual violence against women by partisan fighters, while officially prohibited and in theory subject to military discipline, occurred in practice. Women who were captured by enemy forces faced additional horrors beyond the interrogation and execution that faced their male counterparts. Rape and sexual torture were common in German, Italian, and Ustasha interrogations of female prisoners. The testimonies of women who survived capture and were later released, or who witnessed what happened to those who were not, described treatment that was even more brutal than that inflicted on male prisoners. Against this background, the courage of women like Lepa Radic, Nada Dimic, and the many others who maintained their composure and their silence under interrogation is all the more striking. One of the most remarkable of the female partisan commanders was Ruža Šulentic, born in 1907 in Croatia, who served as a military commissar and commander in various capacities throughout the war, and survived to see its end. Šulentic was one of the experienced communist women who helped train younger fighters like Lepa in the political and military disciplines of the resistance. Her survival was as important as the deaths of those who fell, because the movement needed people who could carry the experience and knowledge of early resistance through to the moment of liberation. But the names and stories of those who survived are, inevitably, less burnished by legend than those of the ones who died. History, and particularly the commemorative history of resistance movements, tends to canonize the martyrs over the survivors. Lepa Radic is remembered more vividly than most of the women who fought alongside her and lived. Not because what she did was necessarily more admirable than what they did, but because the specific circumstances of her death gave her story its particular, iconic quality. Let us now turn to one of the most dramatic episodes in the entire Yugoslav resistance, an episode that illustrates with particular clarity both the desperate conditions the partisans faced and the extraordinary resilience that allowed them to survive against overwhelming odds. This is the story of the Battle of the Neretva, the climax of the Fourth Enemy Offensive that took place in February and March of 1943, roughly simultaneous with Lepa Radic's capture and execution. The timing is not coincidental. The German operations that swept through the Bosanska Krajina and caught Lepa were part of the same vast military machine that was pressing down on the partisan main body from the north and east, while the main German, Italian and Chetnik forces closed in from the south and west. By February 1943, the partisan main body, Tito's forces, was in an extraordinarily precarious position. Caught between the various components of the German encirclement, moving through winter mountains with thousands of wounded fighters who could not be abandoned, the partisans were running out of room to maneuver. To their south lay the Neretva River, swollen with winter snowmelt, running fast and cold through a deep gorge. To cross the Neretva under fire with wounded soldiers against the opposition of Italian forces on the far bank and Chetnik forces positioned to block any breakout seemed almost impossible. And yet, it was the only option that offered any possibility of survival. Tito made a decision that his commanders initially questioned. He ordered the destruction of the bridges across the Neretva to prevent Italian forces from using them to attack the partisan rear, even though this meant the partisans themselves would have to build or improvise their own crossing. He then ordered a feint to the north, convincing the German command that the partisans intended to break out in that direction, which bought time and misdirected German pressure. And finally, he launched the assault across the Neretva. Partisan engineers worked under fire to construct a makeshift bridge from the wreckage of a destroyed span. Fighters crossed under constant bombardment. The wounded were carried on stretchers, some of them on the backs of other fighters. And in the last days of February and the first days of March 1943, the partisan main body crossed the Neretva and broke out of the encirclement. The fourth offensive had failed. Tito's army had survived. The Battle of the Neretva became, in Yugoslav national memory, one of the great moments of the Liberation War. It was commemorated in films, books, monuments, and school curricula throughout the decades of socialist Yugoslavia. The scale of the German failure was significant. 90,000 or more troops had been deployed with the explicit goal of destroying the partisan leadership and main body, and despite inflicting serious losses, they had failed. More importantly, the leaders had survived. Tito survived. The partisan army survived. and with them survived the political vision of a post-war Yugoslavia built on the principles of brotherhood, unity, and socialist liberation, a vision that would prove just as controversial and complicated in practice as it had been inspiring in theory. What happened to the German commanders most directly responsible for the failures of the anti-partisan offensives and for the crimes committed in their name? The answer is varied and often unsatisfying from the perspective of justice. We have already discussed Alexander Löhr and his execution in Belgrade in 1947, but the commander most directly responsible for the planning and execution of the 4th and 5th offensives, the officer who put together the operational plans that resulted in the deaths of thousands of partisans and civilians alike, was General Rudolf Lütters, who commanded the German forces in the NDH from 1942 to 1944. Lütters was a methodical, professional officer who brought considerable operational skill to the task of destroying the partisan movement. He did not succeed, but in the attempt under his command, his forces committed extensive atrocities against civilian populations. Lütters, however, was not tried by Yugoslav courts. He was captured by American forces at the end of the war and was briefly held as a witness in various proceedings before being released without facing trial himself. He died in West Germany in 1961, having never been formally charged for the crimes committed under his command. His victims, once again, received no justice from him. The story of General Walter Kunze is similarly instructive about the incompleteness of post-war justice in the Balkans theatre. Kunze was a senior German officer who served as deputy commander in the Balkans and who was directly associated with the implementation of the 100-to-1 reprisal policy in Serbia and Greece during 1941 and 1942. He was tried at the Nuremberg hostages trial, one of the 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials conducted by the United States, which dealt specifically with the war crimes of German commanders in the Balkans and in southeastern Europe. Kunze was charged with war, crimes and crimes against humanity for his role in ordering the execution of hostages and civilian reprisals. He was found guilty in October 1948 and sentenced to life imprisonment. This appeared to be a genuine act of justice. A senior German commander found guilty and sentenced to life for ordering the mass execution of civilians. But the story did not end there. Walter Kunze's life sentence was commuted and he was released from prison in 1953. He was free only 8 years after the end of a war in which his orders had resulted in the deaths of thousands of civilians. The early releases of German war criminals from American imprisonment, which began in earnest in the early 1950s, reflected the new geopolitical reality of the Cold War, in which West Germany was being rebuilt as an ally against the Soviet Union. The United States and Britain, which had been pressing Germany hard for reparations and accountability in 1945 and 1946, found by 1950 that their priorities had shifted. Former German officers, some with genuine professional competence, were being considered for roles in the new West German Bundeswehr. The Nuremberg sentences were being reviewed and shortened. Men convicted of war crimes were being released. Kunze went home. He died in 1959 in West Germany. He was 68 years old. He had outlived the war by 14 years. Most of his victims had not lived to see even the end of the war. The broader pattern of post-war accountability for German crimes in Yugoslavia reflects the deep tensions between the competing imperatives of justice and political expediency that shaped the entire post-war settlement in Europe. Yugoslavia was unusual among the countries that had been occupied by Germany in that it had both the will and, to a significant degree, the independent power to conduct its own trials of German war criminals. Most occupied countries in Western Europe were dependent on the Western Allies to bring German officers and officials to trial, which meant that the pace and thoroughness of prosecution was shaped by Allied priorities rather than by the priorities of the victims. Yugoslavia, under Tito's leadership, had liberated itself and was not dependent on the Western Allies for justice. When it wanted to try German war criminals, it did so. When it could catch the men it wanted, it executed them. This gave Yugoslav justice a certain raw directness that stands in contrast to the more procedurally elaborate but sometimes less final justice of the Western tribunals. It also, it must be said, gave it certain characteristics of revolutionary rather than liberal justice. The trials were not always governed by the standards of due process that would be recognized in Western legal systems, and the outcome was rarely in doubt before the proceedings began. But whatever one thinks of the procedural quality of Yugoslav post-war trials, the question of whether the men they executed were guilty of the crimes charged is a different matter. Alexander Löhr ordered the bombing of Belgrade and commanded forces that murdered thousands of Yugoslav civilians. August Schmidhuber commanded a division that burned villages and executed civilians across the Balkans. These were not men whose guilt was fabricated by a vengeful communist government. They were documented war criminals who faced accountability in Yugoslavia when they might have avoided it elsewhere, and who were executed for crimes that genuinely warranted the severest punishment available. The question of whether execution is ever appropriate justice is a philosophical one on which reasonable people disagree. The question of whether these men did what they were accused of is not. Among the German officers who served in Yugoslavia and later faced trial in Western courts, the case of Wilhelm List is particularly instructive. Field Marshal Wilhelm List was one of the most senior German officers to serve in the Balkans theatre. Born on May 14, 1880, in Thiel, Oberkirchberg in Bavaria, List was a career officer who had served in the First World War and risen steadily through the interwar German military to become one of the Wehrmacht's most trusted Army Group commanders. He commanded Army Group South during the initial invasion of Yugoslavia in April 1941, and then commanded Army Group A in the Caucasus during 1942, before being dismissed by Hitler in September 1942 for failing to advance quickly enough toward the Caspian oil fields. His career as an active commander was essentially over after that dismissal, but his time in the Balkans had already established his responsibility for a specific category of war crimes. It was under List's overall command in 1941 and early 1942 that the hostages decree, the official Wehrmacht policy of executing civilian hostages in reprisal for partisan attacks, was systematically implemented in Yugoslavia and Greece. The Kragujevac massacre, which we discussed earlier, occurred while List was the senior German commander in the region. The Kraljevo massacre, in which approximately 1,700 men were executed, occurred at the same time. The massacres in the Šabac area, the burning of villages, the systematic depopulation of areas deemed to be partisan strongholds. All of these occurred under List's command authority in implementation of the reprisal policies that he had the power to moderate or escalate. He escalated them. Wilhelm List was tried at the Nuremberg hostages trial, which ran from 1947 to 1948, along with 11 other senior German commanders. He was charged with war crimes and crimes against humanity for his role in implementing the hostages decree and for the massacres carried out under his command. The trial produced detailed documentation of the crimes, including German military records that established the command chain clearly. List was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. Once again, however, the story did not end there. In December 1952, List's life sentence was commuted by the American High Commissioner John J. McCloy as part of a broader reduction in German war crime sentences that was driven by Cold War political pressures and by lobbying from the new West German government. List was released from Landsberg prison in West Germany in 1952 after serving less than 5 years of a life sentence. He was 72 years old at his release and lived until 1971, dying at the age of 91. He had survived the war, survived the trial, survived imprisonment, and lived 3 more decades in freedom. The civilians of Kragujevac, of Kraljevo, of the hundreds of villages burned under his command, had not been afforded any such extension of life. The release of List and the other convicted German commanders in the early 1950s caused fury in Yugoslavia, Greece, and the other Balkan countries that had suffered under German occupation. Tito's government protested loudly and publicly. The Yugoslav press condemned the releases as a betrayal of the victims and a signal to the world that the Western powers did not actually believe in the principles of international justice that they had proclaimed at Nuremberg. There was, in retrospect, considerable justice to this critique. The early 1950s amnesties for German war criminals, conducted quietly and with minimal public attention in most Western countries, represented one of the most significant failures of post-war accountability. The message sent was not a comfortable one, that war crimes would be prosecuted with great solemnity in the immediate aftermath of defeat, but that prosecution would be abandoned when it became politically inconvenient. Not all the German commanders who bore responsibility for crimes in Yugoslavia escaped justice through Western political expediency, however. One case that stands out is that of General Paul Bader, the military commander of Serbia from December 1941 to August 1943. Beda was the successor to Franz Böhmer as military commander in Serbia and was responsible for the continuation and indeed the institutionalization of the reprisal policy during one of the bloodiest periods of the occupation. Under Beda's command, German forces continued to execute civilian hostages at ratios of 100-1, conducted major clearing operations in areas of partisan activity, and supervised the administration of occupation Serbia with a thorough brutality that kept the Nedić collaborationist government functional while systematically terrorizing the population. Bada was captured by Yugoslav forces at the end of the war and tried in Belgrade. He was found guilty of war crimes, including responsibility for the execution of hostages and the conduct of anti-partisan reprisals, and was sentenced to death. He was executed in Yugoslavia, another instance of Yugoslav justice being both more comprehensive and more final than what was available in the West. The Ustasha leadership that had conducted the systematic genocide of Serbs, Jews and Roma within the NDH represents a different but equally important chapter in the story of post-war accountability, or the lack of it. Ante Pavelić, the Poglavnik, the leader of the Croatian fascist movement and head of state of the NDH, managed to escape Yugoslavia entirely at the war's end. Using the network of Catholic clergy and Nazi escape routes known collectively as the Rat Lines, Pavelić fled first to Austria, then to Italy, where he found refuge in the Vatican city-state and among sympathetic Italian Catholic organizations. In 1948, he emigrated to Argentina, joining the large colony of Nazi war criminals, including Adolf Eichmann, who found refuge there under the Juan Perón government. Pavelić lived in Argentina for years, conducting meetings of Ustasha émigré organizations and making himself available to various right-wing and anti-communist movements that found his experience and contacts useful. In 1957, a Serbian nationalist made an assassination attempt on Pavelić in Buenos Aires, shooting him in the abdomen. He survived, badly wounded, and was spirited away to Spain by his supporters, where he was received by the Franco regime. He died on December 28, 1959, in Madrid, never having been brought to trial for any of the crimes committed under his government. He was 71 years old. The hundreds of thousands of people killed under his orders had no such peaceful death waiting for them. The fate of Pavelić exemplifies the way in which the most senior perpetrators of the Balkan atrocities frequently escape justice through a combination of Western Cold War priorities, the protection of the Catholic Church, the complicity of sympathetic governments, and the simple practicality that large numbers of genuine war criminals are very difficult to hunt down and prosecute simultaneously. The Yugoslav government made repeated requests for the extradition of Pavelić and other Ustasha fugitives from the countries that harboured them and was repeatedly refused. Argentina, Spain and even the Vatican declined to cooperate. The result was that while mid-level Ustasha officers who were unlucky enough to be captured by Yugoslav forces in 1945 were tried and executed, the leadership escaped and lived relatively comfortable lives in exile. One of the Ustasha commanders who did face Yugoslav justice was Vjekoslav Luburić, the man responsible for overseeing the Jasenovac concentration camp system and one of the most personally brutal figures in the entire apparatus of NDH genocide. Born on September 14, 1914, in Humac near Ljubuški in Herzegovina, Luburić had been involved with the Ustasha movement from an early age and had risen through its ranks to become one of Pavelić's most trusted executioners. As the administrator of the Jasenovac camp complex, he was personally present at many of the mass killings and is described in survivor testimonies as someone who participated in the murders himself, taking personal pleasure in the violence. Under his oversight, tens of thousands of people were killed at Jasenovac and in the related campsites. Luburić, however, managed to escape Yugoslavia at the war's end and made his way, like Pavelić, through the rat lines to Spain. He lived in Madrid under a false name, eventually founding a Croatian émigré organization. He died on April 20th, 1969, the anniversary of Hitler's birth and a date which he apparently chose to celebrate when a bomb planted by what appear to have been Yugoslav intelligence operatives exploded in his apartment in Carcassonne, Spain. He was 54 years old. Yugoslav state security, operating under the codename UDBA, had reached him where the formal processes of justice could not. The broader history of Yugoslav partisan suffering during the occupation cannot be fully told without discussing the specific campaigns that the German military command conducted against partisan areas and the communities that supported them. Among the most destructive of these operations, beyond the 4th and 5th offensives we have already discussed, was a series of operations in 1942 that are sometimes collectively called the 2nd and 3rd Enemy Offensives, though the precise numbering of the offensives is a matter of Yugoslav military historiography rather than a naming convention the Germans used. What is clear is that throughout 1942, the Germans, Italians, and their various collaborationist partners mounted repeated large-scale military operations in eastern Bosnia, Montenegro, Herzegovina, and the Neretva Valley aimed at destroying partisan units and the populations that sustained them. These operations claimed enormous numbers of lives, both among partisan fighters and among civilians who were caught in the crossfire or deliberately targeted in reprisals. One of the most distinctive aspects of the German anti-partisan campaigns in Yugoslavia was the deliberate use of hunger as a weapon. The systematic seizure of food supplies from rural areas suspected of supporting the partisans, the destruction of livestock and agricultural infrastructure, and the blockading of areas under partisan control were all standard elements of German operational planning. In a region where subsistence farming was the norm and food reserves were thin at the best of times, the removal of food stocks during the winter months could condemn entire communities to starvation. The Germans were well aware of this effect and employed it deliberately. The partisan medical services, which operated in extraordinarily difficult conditions throughout the war, documented cases of severe malnutrition and starvation among both fighters and civilian populations in areas that had been subjected to intensive German clearing operations. The wounded, whom the partisans were constantly carrying from one location to another, the thousands of stretcher cases that complicated every military operation and slowed every withdrawal, were partly a product of inadequate nutrition that left wounds slow to heal and bodies unable to recover from injuries that might have been managed more easily in better conditions. And yet, the partisan medical services, operating in these appalling conditions, managed to achieve a great deal. The Yugoslav partisans developed one of the most remarkable field medical systems of any resistance movement in the Second World War, partly out of absolute necessity and partly out of ideological commitment. The decision not to abandon wounded fighters, which was both a tactical obligation and a moral one, required that the partisans build a working medical infrastructure in the field. Partisan hospitals were set up in caves, in forests, in farm buildings, wherever any degree of shelter could be found. Medical personnel, from trained doctors who had joined the resistance to nurses and orderlies who learned their skills in the field, operated with minimal supplies, improvised from whatever they could find or capture. During the 4th offensive, when the partisans were fighting their way to the Neretva with thousands of wounded, the effort to maintain the wounded column, to carry the people who could not walk across the winter mountains while under fire, was one of the defining images of the entire war. An image of a movement that refused to treat its most vulnerable members as disposable. The German approach to the partisan wounded was the inverse of this. When German forces overran partisan field hospitals, the occupants were routinely executed. There are documented instances from multiple operations in which wounded partisan fighters, unable to flee and found in partisan hospital sites by advancing German forces, were killed where they lay. This was not an accident or an excess of individual soldiers. It was a consequence of the broader German policy of treating captured partisans as criminals rather than prisoners of war, a policy that extended its logic, without sentimentality to those who were too severely wounded to constitute any threat. The contrast between the partisan willingness to carry their wounded at enormous cost and the German willingness to execute the enemy wounded at minimal cost is one of the sharpest moral contrasts in the entire narrative of the Yugoslav Liberation War. Among the younger partisan commanders who rose to prominence in this period and whose story deserves telling is Ivan Lola Hribar, born on June 25, 1916, in Zagreb. Hribar was the son of Ivan Hribar Sr., a prominent Serbian politician who had chaired the Constituent Assembly that drafted Yugoslavia's first constitution after World War I. The younger Hribar, known universally by his nickname Lola, had become a committed communist in his university years at Zagreb and had been one of the leading figures of the communist student movement in the late 1930s. When the invasion came in 1941, Lola Hribar was one of the first generation of communist activists to throw themselves into the partisan resistance, and he rose quickly to become one of Tito's most trusted young commanders and organizers. He was handsome, charismatic, and deeply committed, and in the peculiar democracy of the partisan movement, where rank was earned through demonstrated ability and courage rather than inherited or purchased, he had earned genuine respect among fighters who were themselves extraordinary people. Lepa Radic served as the secretary of the Anti-Fascist Youth League of Yugoslavia, the youth organization parallel to SKOJ that mobilized broader support for the resistance among young people who were not necessarily Communist Party members. He participated in the major strategic conferences of the partisan leadership, including the famous Jajce Conference of November 1943, at which the Anti-Fascist Council of the National Liberation of Yugoslavia, the AVNOJ, proclaimed itself the supreme legislative and executive body of liberated Yugoslavia, an act of enormous political significance that established the legal basis for the post-war Yugoslav state. Lepa Radic played an important organizational role in the preparations for the Jajce conference, but just weeks after the conference, as he was attempting to fly out of the liberated territory to make contact with Allied commanders, his aircraft was attacked by German fighters, and Lepa Radic was killed. He was 27 years old. His death was a significant personal blow to Tito, who had come to genuinely regard him as a close comrade, and his loss, following almost immediately after the achievement of the Jajce conference, gave the partisan leadership one of its sharpest individual griefs of the entire war. The losses sustained by the partisan leadership during the war were extraordinary in their cumulative weight. Across the years of the liberation struggle, the movement lost one after another of its most capable and committed fighters, shot in combat, captured and executed, killed, in accidents or dying from disease and the accumulated physical destruction of years of guerrilla warfare. Each loss had to be absorbed, grieved, and metabolized into renewed determination. The movement's extraordinary resilience in the face of these losses was partly a function of its ideological framework, which gave meaning to sacrifice, and partly a function of the extraordinary quality of the people it attracted, people who were, by the mere fact of their presence, self-selected for courage and commitment. You did not join the partisans in 1941 or 1942 without knowing clearly what you were risking. Those who joined anyway were, almost by definition, people of unusual qualities. One of the most moving aspects of the partisan resistance is how young so many of its fighters were. Lepa Radic, who joined at 15 and died at 17, was extreme but not unique. There were thousands of SKOJ members like her, teenagers who chose armed resistance at an age when most young people in peacetime would have been finishing school and thinking about their futures. The average age of partisan fighters in the early years of the resistance was remarkably low. Many units contained fighters who were 16, 17, 18 years old. These were children who had grown up in a world of poverty and political repression, who had seen the invasion destroy everything familiar, who had often lost family members to occupation violence, and who had made adult choices under conditions that no child should have to face. The maturity and courage they demonstrated, the quality of their decision-making under pressure, the clarity of their values in circumstances designed to destroy clarity. These qualities are astonishing to contemplate across the distance of 80 years. The story of Milunka Savić deserves a mention here, even though her story comes from an earlier war, because she represents a tradition of Serbian and Yugoslav female heroism on which the partisan women of the Second World War explicitly drew. Savić was born around 1892 in a village near Vranje in southern Serbia and became one of the most decorated female combatants in the history of the First World War. She served as a soldier in the Serbian army during the Balkan Wars and then, in the First World War, was wounded multiple times, won the French Légion d'honneur and the Croix de Guerre among many other decorations, and became a figure of genuine national legend. When the partisan women of the Second World War were constructing their own sense of identity and purpose, the tradition of women like Milunka Savić was part of the cultural vocabulary available to them, part of what told them that a woman with a weapon defending her homeland was not doing something strange or transgressive, but something that had precedent and honour in their own history. Lepa Radic did not fight in a cultural vacuum. She fought in a society that, whatever its contradictions and traditional limitations, also contained within its collective memory the image of women who had picked up guns and proven themselves. The German military commanders who conducted anti-partisan operations in Yugoslavia were not a monolithic group in terms of their attitudes toward the violence they were ordered to commit. There were soldiers among them who were deeply uncomfortable with the reprisal policies, who found the execution of civilian hostages morally repugnant and said so, at least in internal communications. General Kurt von Geithner, for example, who served under various commanders in the Balkans theatre, filed reports in 1941 and 1942 expressing alarm at the scale and nature of the reprisal executions, noting that they were counterproductive from a purely military standpoint because they were driving the population into the arms of the partisans rather than intimidating them into submission. His protests were overridden. The reprisal policy continued, and von Geithner continued to serve and to implement the orders he objected to, because the Wehrmacht's organizational culture made individual moral resistance extraordinarily difficult and career-ending, even when it stopped short of direct insubordination. This dynamic, the dynamic of the professional soldier who personally objects to specific policies but continues to implement them because the alternative is perceived as too costly personally or professionally, is one that recurs throughout the history of German war crimes and that raises profound questions about the nature of moral responsibility within hierarchical institutions. Among the Italian commanders who served in Yugoslavia, the figure of General Mario Robotti deserves particular attention both for what he did and for what happened to him afterward. Robotti commanded the Italian 11th Army Corps in occupied Slovenia and Dalmatia from 1942 and was responsible for implementing Italian occupation policy in a region that had significant partisan activity. Robotti was notable for issuing an order in 1942 that became infamous even by the standards of Italian occupation policy. He instructed his units that Italian internment camps in the region were becoming too full and that his forces needed to be, as he put it, more energetic in dealing with the problem, a phrase understood by his subordinates to mean that prisoners should be killed rather than interned. Italian forces under his command conducted mass internment of Slovenian civilians, burning villages and deporting entire communities to concentration camps on Italian islands, where the death rate from disease, hunger and mistreatment was extremely high. The Italian detention camp on the island of Rab, known in Italian as Arbe, held over 10,000 Slovenian and Croatian civilians at its peak and had a death rate that some historians have compared to conditions in German concentration camps. Mario Robotti was charged with war crimes by Yugoslav authorities after the war. However, Italy and Yugoslavia reached a diplomatic agreement in the late 1940s that resulted in a general amnesty for Italian war crimes in Yugoslavia, in exchange for Yugoslav recognition of various other post-war territorial and political arrangements. Robotti was therefore never tried, never convicted, and never punished for any of the crimes committed under his command. He died in Rome in 1971 at the age of 88. The Slovenian and Croatian victims of Italian occupation received no justice from the formal legal system. This amnesty for Italian war crimes in Yugoslavia is one of the most overlooked chapters in the history of post-war accountability, largely because it was politically convenient for all the governments involved and deeply inconvenient for any honest narrative of the occupation. The complexity of Yugoslav wartime history is also illustrated by the story of the Chetniks, the royalist resistance movement under General Dragoljub Mihailović, whose relationship with the partisans moved from initial cooperation to violent conflict. The Chetniks were Serbian royalists who drew their membership primarily from Serbian officers of the Royal Yugoslav Army and from Serbian peasant communities in Serbia, Bosnia, and Montenegro. Mihailović, a career Serbian officer, had taken to the mountains when Yugoslavia fell and began organizing resistance. In the summer of 1941, the Chetniks and the partisans briefly cooperated, but the two movements were fundamentally incompatible in both ideology and strategy. Mihailović and the Chetnik leadership were royalists, not communists, and they were deeply suspicious of what a communist-led resistance would mean for post-war Yugoslavia. They were also strategically conservative, preferring to build their forces for a final offensive when the Allies landed, rather than conducting the kind of active resistance that invited German reprisals against Serb civilians. This divergence in strategy led to open conflict between the Chetniks and the partisans beginning in the autumn of 1941, a conflict that became, in many areas of Yugoslavia, essentially a civil war within the occupation. The Chetniks, finding themselves unable to compete with the partisans for popular support and military effectiveness, began collaborating with Italian and German forces against the partisans, providing intelligence, participating in joint operations, and in some cases actually fighting alongside the occupation forces. Chetnik units participated in the encirclement operations of the Fourth Enemy Offensive in early 1943. The same Chetnik forces that were officially described by the Yugoslav government in exile and initially by the British as resistance fighters were actually fighting alongside the Germans in the operations that caught and killed Lepa Radic. The moral complexity of this situation is genuinely difficult. Many Chetnik fighters were not enthusiastic collaborators, but men caught in impossible circumstances, choosing the pragmatic survival of their immediate communities over the ideological purity of continued resistance. Some Chetnik commanders resisted the collaboration tendency and maintained genuine anti-German operations. The Chetnik movement was not a single entity, but a collection of local commanders with varying politics and varying relationships to the occupation authorities. But the overall trajectory of the movement's leadership toward collaboration is documented in extensive German and Italian records, and the consequences of that collaboration, in terms of the additional pressure it placed on the partisans and the additional deaths it caused, were real. Dragoljub Mihailović was captured by Yugoslav government forces in March 1946 and tried before a Yugoslav military court in June of that year. The charges against him included collaboration with the occupation forces, conducting operations against the Yugoslav partisans, and war crimes against civilians in areas of Chetnik control. He was found guilty on all major charges and sentenced to death. He was executed by firing squad in Belgrade on July 17, 1946. The trial was widely condemned in the West as a show trial conducted by a communist government against a political rival, and the verdict was disputed by Mihailovic's supporters both inside Yugoslavia and among the Yugoslav émigré community abroad. The United States government, for example, awarded Mihailović the Legion of Merit in 1948, 2 years after his execution, in recognition of his assistance to Allied airmen who had been shot down over Yugoslavia and were sheltered by Chetnik units. The award was highly controversial and illustrated the degree to which the Western judgment of Mihailović was shaped by Cold War considerations and wartime Allied associations rather than by a sober assessment of his actual conduct during the occupation. The history of the German anti-partisan operations in Yugoslavia also involves the extensive use of collaborationist forces recruited from the Yugoslav population itself. The Serbian Volunteer Corps, the Nedić government's gendarmerie and regular forces, the Ustaša militia, the Croatian Home Guard, and various other formations all served as supplements to the German and Italian military presence. These forces were in many ways more feared by the partisan resistance than the regular German army, because they knew the terrain, spoke the language, had local knowledge of communities and individuals, and in many cases had personal grudges, ethnic animosities, or simple opportunism driving them to particular cruelty. The local collaborators who participated in operations against partisan sympathizers in villages and towns were often the ones who identified specific individuals for arrest or execution, who guided German search parties to hidden caches of weapons or food, who pointed out which families had sons or daughters in the partisans. The aftermath of the war for these collaborators was, in general, far harsher than for the German officers and officials who commanded them. German officers had the protection of the West German state and its Cold War utility to the United States. Local Yugoslav collaborators had nothing. Hundreds of thousands of them fled with the retreating German forces in the final stages of the war, and the fate of those who were captured by partisan forces or who were returned to Yugoslavia by the Allies ranged from immediate execution without trial to show trials of varying degrees of procedural legitimacy. The massacres at Bleiburg in Austria in May 1945, where Yugoslav communist forces killed large numbers of Ustaša soldiers, Croatian Home Guard soldiers, and civilian collaborators who had surrendered to British forces and were then handed back to the partisans, represent one of the darkest chapters of the immediate post-war period in Yugoslavia. A mass killing that the post-war Yugoslav government suppressed from the official narrative, and that remained a deeply contested historical memory well into the 21st century. How does all of this bring us back to Lepa Radic? In one sense, the broader history of Yugoslav suffering, German crimes, Ustaša genocide, Chetnik collaboration, and imperfect post-war justice is the world that made Lepa Radic who she was, and the world in which her courage had its meaning. She was not a historical accident. She was the product of a specific family, a specific community, a specific set of political and ethical commitments, and a specific set of historical circumstances that demanded of her, and of thousands of others like her, something almost beyond what human beings can be expected to give. That she gave it is remarkable. That she was not alone in giving it, that the Yugoslav partisan movement produced hundreds of similar stories of similar courage, does not diminish her but contextualizes her. Her extraordinary quality was not isolated but representative of something in the people, and the movement that she was part of. The Bosanska Krajina region where Lepa Radic lived and died was one of the most fought-over areas of occupied Yugoslavia, a region that experienced both Ustaša genocide against its Serb population and intense German anti-partisan operations throughout the war. The villages of the Krajina, including Lepa's own village of Gaznica and the nearby town of Bosanska Gradiška, experienced successive waves of violence. Ustaša massacres of Serbs in 1941. German reprisal operations throughout 1942 and 1943, intensive fighting between partisans and occupation forces, and the destruction of communities that simply had the misfortune to be in the path of whatever military forces were moving through them at any given moment. The physical landscape of the Krajina, its forests and river valleys and mountain ridges, became the stage for operations that claimed enormous numbers of lives, and the communities that survived them were shaped in ways that would define the region's politics and psychology for generations. The specific location where Lepa Radic was executed, the area near the village of Vranješ in the Bosanska Gradiška municipality, is today marked with a memorial. After the war, when Yugoslavia was building its commemorative infrastructure of monuments and memorials to the liberation struggle, the sites of partisan executions and battles were marked throughout the country, creating a landscape of memory that connected the present to the past. These memorials, many of them striking pieces of socialist modernist sculpture and architecture, represented one of the most ambitious programs of public commemoration of any conflict in history. Yugoslavia built hundreds of monuments to its fallen partisans, to the victims of fascist occupation, to the battles and massacres of the Liberation War. The memorial at the site of Lepa Radic's execution was one of these, a marker in the landscape that said, here something important happened. Here someone chose dignity over survival. Here a teenage girl from a small village became a symbol of something larger than herself. The commemorative monuments of socialist Yugoslavia were not merely aesthetic or political gestures. They served a specific function in the society that built them. Yugoslavia after 1945 was a country that had experienced within the space of 4 years an invasion, a civil war, a genocide, and a liberation. It had lost, by the most commonly cited estimates, over 1 million people, though some estimates run as high as 1.7 million. The exact figure is disputed and was politically contested throughout the decades of socialist Yugoslavia, but whatever the precise number, the proportion of the population lost was extraordinary, one of the highest of any country involved in the war. To rebuild a society on that foundation of grief and violence required, among other things, a shared narrative that gave the losses meaning and created the possibility of moving forward together. The monuments to fallen partisans and the victims of fascism, the schools and streets named after heroes like Lepa Radic and Stjepan Filipović and Rade Končar, the national holidays and commemorative ceremonies were all part of that project of meaning-making. The communist Yugoslav government under Tito was, of course, not disinterested in this commemorative project. The celebration of the partisan resistance and its heroes served obvious political purposes. It legitimized the rule of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, which had led the resistance. It established a founding myth for the new state that positioned it as the product of popular struggle, rather than Soviet imposition. And it provided a moral framework that could be used to demand loyalty and sacrifice from the population for the project of socialist construction. The instrumentalization of heroes like Lepa Radic by the communist state is real and should not be ignored. The fact that she was turned into a symbol, her image reproduced on monuments and in textbooks, her story shaped and simplified for political purposes, is something that the full historical account must acknowledge. But instrumentalization does not nullify the underlying reality. Lepa Radic was a real person who did a real thing, who made a real choice, and the choice was genuinely heroic, regardless of the political uses to which it was subsequently put. What was it actually like for Lepa Radic's family in the years after her execution? Her father, Dusan Radic, the communist activist who had shaped her politics, survived the war. He had to live with the knowledge that his political commitments had been passed to his daughter, that she had taken them so seriously that she had given her life for them, and that his role in forming her character was therefore bound up with both her heroism and her death. The grief of a parent for a child who dies at 17 in the circumstances Lepa died is not something that can be fully imagined from the outside. It is simply one of the most profound forms of human suffering. And yet, Dusan Radic lived in a Yugoslavia that publicly celebrated his daughter's memory, that named schools after her, that taught children about her courage. He lived to see her become a national hero. Whatever complicated emotions that must have involved, for him personally, the public mourning and public celebration of his daughter was a constant presence in his life. The legacy of Lepa Radic in Yugoslav national consciousness is inseparable from the broader project of building and then maintaining the socialist Yugoslav state. For the 4 decades between 1945 and the late 1980s, she was a central figure in the commemorative culture of the country, one of the canonical martyrs of the liberation struggle. Her name was known to every child in Yugoslavia. Her story was told in schools, in books, in films. The monument at the site of her execution was a place of pilgrimage, and on the anniversaries of significant partisan battles and liberation events, official delegations would gather there, as they did at dozens of similar sites across the country, to lay wreaths and make speeches. This was, in one sense, the most that could be done for someone who had died as she had, to ensure that her death was not merely a private tragedy, but a public memory, a shared possession of the nation she had fought for. The dissolution of Yugoslavia in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and the catastrophic wars that accompanied it, created a profound crisis for this commemorative culture. The monuments, the street names, the national holidays, the entire infrastructure of Yugoslav communist memory were suddenly politically contested in ways they had not been for decades. In the successor states that emerged from Yugoslavia's dissolution, Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, Macedonia, and later Kosovo, the question of whose heroes to honour and which wars to remember became a deeply divisive political issue. For Croatian nationalists, celebrating partisan heroes was complicated by the fact that the partisans had fought against, among others, the Croatian Ustaša regime, making partisan commemoration feel, to some, like a repudiation of Croatian national aspirations. For Serbian nationalists, the partisan narrative was associated with communist rule and Tito's Yugoslavia rather than with Serbian national memory in its specifically Chetnik tradition. The wars of the 1990s themselves reopened all the wounds of the Second World War, with Serb, Croat and Bosnian forces committing atrocities against each other that were consciously framed by their perpetrators as settling scores from the earlier conflict. In this environment, figures like Lepa Radic, who had been celebrated as Yugoslav heroes, became contested in new ways. In the successor state of Bosnia and Herzegovina, where she had lived and died, her memory survived more intact than in some other contexts, partly because the multi-ethnic character of the partisan resistance resonated with the aspirations of those who wanted a multi-ethnic Bosnian state. But the systematic dismantling of Yugoslav commemorative culture that occurred throughout the 1990s meant that many of the monuments, street names, and institutional references that had kept figures like her in public consciousness were removed or renamed. The school in Bosanska Gradiška that had been named after her was renamed. The public squares that bore partisan names across the former Yugoslavia were given new names reflecting the national priorities of the new states. The landscape of memory was being redrawn, and yet Lepa Radic's story has survived. It has survived the dissolution of the country she died for. It has survived the political upheavals and the revisionist histories and the deliberate forgetting. It has survived because the story itself has a quality that transcends its specific ideological context, the quality of a 17-year-old girl who chose death over betrayal and who faced the end of her short life with extraordinary composure and defiance. That story does not require socialism or Yugoslav national identity to carry its meaning. It requires only a recognition of what courage looks like when it is stripped of all pretense and all protection, when it is reduced to its absolute essence, a single person in the absolute worst circumstances, choosing to act in accordance with their values at the cost of everything. The question of what made Lepa Radic's courage possible is one that historians, psychologists and philosophers have approached from many different angles. Was it ideology? Ideology clearly played a role. Her political convictions gave her a framework in which self-sacrifice was not merely acceptable, but meaningful, in which dying without betraying was understood as a contribution to the struggle rather than a waste. Was it youth? There is a specific quality to the courage of very young people that sometimes differs from the courage of adults. Adolescents in certain circumstances can be less frightened of death, not because they are brave in the fully adult sense, but because they have not yet fully internalized their own mortality in the way that adults typically do. Was it character? Almost certainly. The accounts of people who knew Lepa Radic describe someone with an unusual self-possession and clarity of purpose even before the war. Someone who had thought carefully about what she believed and why and was not easily shaken by opposition or pressure. Probably all of these factors were present in some combination. But there is also perhaps something else, something harder to quantify, the specific social and relational context of the partisan movement itself. Lepa Radic was not alone when she made the choices she made. She was part of a community, a network of people who shared her values, who would have known what she had done when she refused to betray them, who would have honoured her memory and kept it alive. The knowledge that your sacrifice will be witnessed, understood and honoured by the people who matter to you is not the same as the knowledge that it will be officially commemorated by a state, but it may be a more fundamental component of the courage it takes to make that sacrifice. Lepa knew her comrades. She knew that if she kept silent and died, they would know what she had done and why. That knowledge may have been, in those final moments, one of the things that made it possible to keep silent when speaking would have been so much easier. Let us now think about some of the other figures whose stories intersect with Lepa Radic's and who illuminate different aspects of the German occupation of Yugoslavia and its long aftermath. One figure who deserves particular attention is SS Obergruppenführer Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the head of the Reich Security Main Office from 1943, who had ultimate command authority over the SD, the SS Intelligence Service, and the Gestapo, and therefore over the security and intelligence operations conducted throughout occupied Europe, including Yugoslavia. Kaltenbrunner was an Austrian-born SS general who had replaced Reinhard Heydrich after the latter's assassination in Prague in 1942. He was one of the most senior SS officials to survive the war and stand trial at the main Nuremberg trial in 1945 and 1946. Under his authority, the security services that hunted partisan fighters and resistance members across occupied Europe operated. The interrogations of captured partisans, the torture, the executions. These were not random acts of individual cruelty, but the output of a system that Kaltenbrunner commanded. He was convicted at Nuremberg of war crimes and crimes against humanity and was hanged on October 16, 1946. He was 43 years old. Of all the senior figures responsible for the deaths of people like Lepa Radic, Kaltenbrunner is one of the few who faced fully proportionate justice. The story of how the Allied powers, particularly the United States and Britain, decided to support Tito's partisans over Mihailovic's Chetniks is one of the more intriguing intelligence and diplomatic stories of the entire war, and it had direct consequences for the ultimate outcome of the Yugoslav liberation struggle. For much of 1942 and into 1943, British policy was to support Mihailović as the primary Yugoslav resistance, partly because he was the representative of the royal government in exile that the British recognised, and partly because early intelligence assessments, many of them based on incomplete or deliberately misleading information, portrayed the Chetniks as the most effective resistance force. The Special Operations Executive, the British Irregular Warfare Agency that was parachuting agents and supplies into Yugoslavia, was running missions to both the partisans and the Chetniks, but official. British support went primarily to Mihailović. The shift came in 1943, driven by better intelligence, by the reports of British liaison officers who were on the ground with both movements, and by the growing evidence from German records captured by the Allies that the Chetniks were collaborating with the occupation forces, while the partisans were conducting genuine, large-scale military operations. A British liaison officer named Fitzroy MacLean was parachuted into Tito's headquarters in September 1943 with a brief to assess the partisans and report back. His assessment was unambiguous. The partisans were fighting an effective war, were the dominant resistance force in Yugoslavia, and deserved full Allied support. Maclean's reports, supported by the assessments of other SOE officers, convinced Winston Churchill to switch British support from Mihailović to Tito. At the Tehran Conference in November and December 1943, the Allied leaders, Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin, formally agreed to support Tito's partisans. American and British supplies, weapons, ammunition and air support began flowing to the partisan movement in quantities that would prove decisive in the later stages of the war. This Allied support came too late to help Lepa Radic and the thousands of partisans who died in 1941, 1942 and early 1943, fighting with minimal resources against an overwhelming enemy. It came too late for the countless civilians who were killed in German reprisals before anyone in Washington or London was paying close attention to what was happening in the mountains of Bosnia and the villages of Serbia. But it came in time to help tilt the balance in the final phase of the war, to supply the partisan army with the weapons and equipment it needed to grow from a guerrilla force into a conventional military organization capable of taking on German divisions in open battle. By the autumn of 1944, with Soviet forces advancing through Romania and Bulgaria, with American and British supplies pouring in, and with the partisan army now numbering over 800,000 fighters, the liberation of Yugoslavia became a military reality. German forces began withdrawing along the same routes they had used to advance in April 1941. Belgrade was liberated in October 1944. The NDH collapsed in the spring of 1945. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, Yugoslavia was free, and it was free because of the extraordinary resilience and sacrifice of the partisan movement that figures like Lepa Radic had embodied and served. The liberation brought its own complicated violence. The settling of scores, both the formal trials and the informal or extrajudicial killings that accompanied the partisan victory, produced significant casualties and considerable moral ambiguity. The Bleiburg massacres in Austria, the executions of Chetnik fighters and Ustasha soldiers, the killings of real and suspected collaborators across the country. These events remind us that the end of one kind of violence does not automatically produce justice or peace. The partisan movement that had demonstrated such extraordinary moral courage in the face of Nazi repression was not immune to committing its own violence once it held power. This is not a reason to condemn the resistance, but it is a reason to tell its story with full honesty, rather than with the uncritical hagiography that characterized much of the official Yugoslav communist commemoration. Tito himself, who had led the partisans from their earliest days to their ultimate victory, lived until 1980, dying on May 4th of that year at the extraordinary age of 87. He had ruled Yugoslavia for 35 years, first as Prime Minister and then as President for life, building a specific brand of socialist governance that differed from the Soviet model in important ways, including the worker self-management system, genuine non-alignment in foreign policy, and a commitment to the unity of Yugoslavia's diverse peoples that was never fully achieved but always proclaimed. His death removed the single figure who had done more than anyone else to hold Yugoslavia together, and within a decade the country he had built would begin its dissolution into the catastrophic wars of the 1990s. The Yugoslavia that Lepa Radic and the partisans had fought to create, the brotherhood and unity that was the movement's central political promise, did not survive for even 50 years past the liberation. What does it mean then for Lepa Radic to have died for a country and a cause that no longer exist? It is a question that many of the commemorated heroes of socialist Yugoslavia implicitly pose, now that the state they died for is gone and the ideology they served is discredited. It is a question without an easy answer. The simplest answer is that what Lepa Radic did was not, at its core, about ideology or about the specific form of Yugoslavia that emerged from the war. It was about refusing to betray other people. It was about choosing solidarity over self-preservation, about deciding that the lives of her comrades were worth more than her own continued existence. Those are not communist values, specifically. They are human values of a very deep kind, values that have been honoured across cultures and centuries, and they do not expire when the political structures that once celebrated them collapse. Among the many remarkable stories that the Yugoslav liberation struggle produced, and that help give full context to what Lepa Radic's sacrifice meant, is the story of Miloš Masalović, a Serbian partisan who survived the war and lived to tell what it was like to be part of the movement in its darkest years. Masalović had joined the partisans as a 17-year-old in 1941 and had served through the entire Liberation War, including some of the most desperate periods of the enemy offensives. In interviews conducted decades later, he described what kept him and his comrades going through years of privation: cold, hunger, constant danger, and the deaths of friends and comrades. His answer was not primarily about ideology, though he acknowledged that ideology provided a framework. It was about the people around him, the specific individuals he fought with, the obligations he felt toward them, the knowledge that in a world where everything else had been stripped away, the loyalty of a person to the group they had chosen to be part of was the one thing that remained within their control. Masalović's description of partisan solidarity, the specific quality of the bonds formed in those conditions, helps explain what Lepa Radic was protecting when she refused to name her comrades. She was not protecting an abstract cause. She was protecting specific people she knew and cared about. The long shadow of the Second World War in Yugoslavia extends into the present in ways that are still actively shaping politics and society in the Balkans today. The wars of the 1990s were not simply the product of ancient ethnic hatreds, as was often argued in the Western media at the time. They were partly the product of specific political manipulations by specific political actors who deliberately mobilized the memories of wartime atrocities, especially Ustaša crimes against Serbs and partisan reprisals against Croats, to create fear and justify new violence. The memory of Jasenovac, of the massacres of 1941, of the reprisals and counter-reprisals of the occupation years, fed directly into the violence of the Serb-Croat conflict in the 1990s, in the regions where those original atrocities had occurred, including the Bosanska Krajina, the region where Lepa Radic had lived and died. Memory in the Balkans has never been merely retrospective. It is a living force that shapes the present. The international legal developments that followed the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s produced, ironically, a significantly more developed framework of international humanitarian law and war crimes prosecution than anything that had existed in the 1940s. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, established by the United Nations Security Council in 1993, prosecuted dozens of individuals for war crimes committed during the Bosnian War, the Croatian War, and the Kosovo conflict, including some of the most senior political and military leaders of the conflicting parties. These prosecutions, whatever their limitations, represented a genuine advance in the application of international justice to war crimes. They established the principle that sitting presidents and generals could be indicted and tried for crimes against humanity, a principle that has since been built into the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. In a strange way, the failure of post-war justice in Yugoslavia after the Second World War, the release of Kunce and List, the escape of Pavelić, the general amnesty for Italian crimes contributed to the development of better frameworks for the future as the inadequacies of the Nuremberg-era prosecutions were identified and addressed in subsequent decades. This brings us finally back to the girl in the snow. Lepa Radic, 17 years old, standing under a tree in February 1943, being asked one last time to speak and choosing silence. We know the end of her story, but we cannot know what was in her mind in those final moments. What we can know is what she did, and what it meant to the people who heard about it, both then and in the 80 years since. It meant that resistance was possible even in the worst circumstances. It meant that the occupiers, for all their military power, for all the brutality of their reprisal policies, could not make people betray each other simply by threatening death. It meant that there was something in human beings that was not subdued by force. It meant to the partisan fighters who heard her story and kept fighting that the cause was worth fighting for, that people worth fighting for existed. History is full of nameless bravery, of people who did extraordinary things that were never recorded or remembered. Lepa Radic is lucky in one terrible sense that her story was specific enough and significant enough to be preserved, that she had a name and a face and a history that could be remembered. The thousands of Yugoslav civilians and fighters who died anonymously in reprisals, in massacres, in the gas chambers of Jasenovac, who left no record and received no commemoration, deserve equal honor but cannot receive it in the same form. What we can do is remember the ones we know about fully and honestly, not as icons stripped of complexity, but as real people whose full humanity makes their choices more rather than less meaningful. Lepa Radic was born on December 19, 1925. She died on February 8, 1943. She was a daughter, a communist, a partisan fighter, a teenager, a young woman from a small Bosnian village who absorbed her father's values and took them seriously, enough to act on them in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. She refused to betray people she loved in order to save her own life. She died shouting about the things she believed in. She was 17 years old. The Nazis who hanged her are, in all probability, completely forgotten by history, their individual names and faces dissolved into the faceless machinery of occupation. Lepa Radic is remembered. That is, in the end, a form of justice too. The story of Yugoslavia's liberation war is one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of human resistance to tyranny. From the desperate early days of 1941, when a handful of communist activists took to the mountains with barely enough weapons to arm a small company, to the final liberation of the country in 1945 with an army of over 800,000 fighters, it traces the arc of what becomes possible when ordinary people refuse to accept the world as the powerful have made it. It is a story full of tragedy, full of moral complexity, full of the complications that arise when human beings operate under pressure of the most extreme kind. It is also a story full of extraordinary courage, extraordinary solidarity, and extraordinary love for the kind of world that does not yet exist, but might if enough people are willing to fight for it. Lepa Radic was one of those people. She was 17 years old, and she was magnificent. Well, that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. We hope you found this deep dive into Lepa Radic's story and the extraordinary world of the Yugoslav partisan resistance both moving and informative. If you enjoyed learning about the remarkable men and women who fought back against Nazi occupation, make sure to check out our video on what happened to Germany's top field marshals after World War II, or our exploration of where the Waffen-SS went after 1945, both of which shed light on the other side of this brutal conflict and what justice looked like, or sometimes failed to look like, in its aftermath. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the history that made our world. We will see you in the next one.